I would like to just tell you a little bit about myself. I have, I went to art school right out of high school. I went I got a diploma, a visual arts diploma, and I went to NASCAD, and I went to Kent State University. So I feel like I had the privilege of an art education. I also feel like it was a confusing project to go to art school with the expectation that one might become an artist after that. I have incredible penmanship, which I credit my graduate degree with. But I feel like I went to a couple of different schools. I think that when I went to NASCAD, I was surrounded by artists, and it sort of, for me, seeded this idea of community. When I went to Kent State, which is, very much a state school, and you see the ROTC singing in groups of military clusters, young people. It was a very different experience, and it was a very institutional experience. So I think in both my NASCAD, going to school at an art school, and going to Kent State to a state school in the U.S., I think were very important places for me to understand what it meant to be an artist in society. And when I graduated, it was 1989, so height of riot girl, just saying. And it took me a long time after that. It took me almost a decade before I actually returned to an art practice. So one of the most readily available circumstances or situations for me as an artist not making anything was the artist-run center movement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's influenced my work and my ideas as an artist a little bit later. But so yeah, it was in the mid-90s before I discovered a way of making things that was both synergistic with the way I wanted to make things and in keeping with what I wanted to make my work about, and it fit into what for me then was an economy that I could manage. So I started making films and videos and doing almost exclusively performance for the camera in the early 90s, and I continue to make that work to this day. So I see my first profession as an artist, but I also see my second profession now as an arts administrator and as an arts advocate, someone who kind of keeps in consistent balance this idea of being a cultural producer and creating the conditions for cultural production. I also think it's important to understand a little bit about how I work, so that when you see the work, you get a better sense of the content. So I kind of think that I work like a squirrel a little bit. So it's very much a case of making a lot of small things. So I shoot a lot of video and I shoot a lot of film. I use every format that you can imagine. So I use high definition cameras, I use toy cameras, I use pixel vision, I use Super 8, I use 16, I use stills, and I often work very much within the limitations, the productive limitations of those technologies. All of the works are gesture-based, or for lack of a better word, they're kind of minimal, they're often site-specific, they're quite raw, they're unedited, and they include my body as the main subject. And so I make a lot of these little works, and then I bury them for a year or two. Sometimes it takes me 2 or 3 years before I can go back to material to formalize it, I guess, or finish it to some extent. And then, I dig them back up a few years later, and I dust them off, and I look at them with fresh eyes, and I generally try to gather up things that go well together and organize them into bigger chunks, suites of work, bodies of work, a series. Maybe those are the best and most familiar words to use. So since 1997, I have made 4 large bodies of work. So 25 plus years of being an artist, and these bodies of work have names. Some of you have been pivotal and instrumental in making them happen. I edited Enlightened Nonsense and Why Always instead of just sometimes a Charles Street video, and worked through organizations like Lyft to process and make Super 8 and 60mm films. I also work at this, and still to this day work at a place called the Independent Imaging Retreat in Mount Forest, Ontario, where I teach every summer. And it's a very small filmmaking environment that focuses on supporting artists. It was established by Phil Hoffman and Marion McMahon as a place primarily for women artists who wanted to work autobiographically and diaristically. And so that was a big influence, and in a way it was one of the things that kickstarted my practice, as well as embarking on 10 years of psychoanalysis. So Enlightened Nonsense is one of those large bodies of work. It's 10 short experimental films. I made a body of work a few years later called Why Always instead of Sometimes, which is 12 works, summer videos, summer films, mostly about reparation. I also made a large suite of works in residence at Open Space in Victoria, which operated for me. They took the gallery apart in a way and offered it to me as a studio for 2 months and then as an exhibition space for another month. I made a suite of works there called It's, which is sort of, I guess, as it sounds, which is totally obscure now that I say it out loud, but It's is sort of about the id, which is the first self. So all of these are self-portraits, and all of them are bodies of work built out of a combination of smaller, shorter works. And still, they don't operate as feature films. They're non-narrative, and they're fairly consistently leaving behind a master narrative. They don't have a beginning, middle, or end. They don't have a storyline or a story to tell. They're essentially the things that are prioritized in the work is that they're physical, that they're personal, that they're emotional, and that they're political. And I think that, as I said at the beginning, I think it's good that some people are really interested in technology and some people are not. I am the not, but not because I'm not interested in talking about it or how it's applied or what it can be or what it can do and what it can offer art making, but really it's because I want the works to not be preoccupied with anything. Like I try not to work beyond my own personal limitations, and because the works have these emotional sources, there's a kind of, I guess, I have a limitation to what I can kind of gather around me in terms of tools. So I'm not super interested in technologies like, the highest quality image or the, I don't get very involved in the editing process or in the outputs. Someone was asking me about my show and about what I was going to be showing on Bright Sun, on a 4K Bright Sun. I said, sure, it sounds great. Do you have one I could use? So I stay within a certain emotional economy with the work, and don't necessarily need to go beyond that with any kind of technologies. But I do spend a lot of time thinking about the sound, the quality of the sound. I spend a lot of time thinking about the size of the image. I spend a lot of time, in fact, probably too much time thinking about this relative scale to space. Most of the works are installations. They can be single channel. They can be shown in these polyamorous relationships where you can see 4 or 5 of Why Always and skip the other 6 or 7. So I spend a lot more time sort of working out how they exist in space. And I think I'm also very conscious of what their affect is and what their effect is on an audience, and have been mostly interested through my work in a discourse or an evolving dialogue around the self as subject, around gender and sexuality, and around the feminist lens and the representation of the female body once was subject, once was object, now is subject, how we've transitioned between understanding the presence of the female body. And I think also, I aspire to complication, I guess, in a way with the work. I know that a lot of the work that I make isn't resolved. I'm aware of leaving it somewhat unresolved. I usually know that if I'm making something that makes me uncomfortable, that I'm probably doing something right. And that is a kind of a difficult and complicated thing in and of itself to kind of sustain, but I kind of firmly believe that the work that I'm making has an unresolvedness to it that I think makes it accessible. So as I've said, the works are fairly minimal, and recently the last body of work that I made for the Images Festival, it has a much more minimal but quite site-specific sensibility to it. Often the works are site-specific. So in the case of the new work, which is currently got a sort of a group title called Snug and Low, which is how you're supposed to wear your seatbelt. It is 6 to 8 new works right now that have a real emphasis on sound, and that were all made in one building. So I did a residency at the Kayak in Dawson City, and if anyone is interested in considering a residency, I would recommend it. It's quite extraordinary. It's very isolating, but for me, that was very productive. And if you go in October or November, you can really just sleep all the time because it's dark all the time. And it's super quiet, and you're like, I feel so rested being here in Dawson City. And then you realize that you've slept for 18 hours. But they offered a studio, and you live in a house with another person, and it gets light at 10 a.m. and it gets dark at 3. So you kind of end up living in this really beautiful, quiet bubble. But there's also limitations, especially when you're in a place that you're unfamiliar with, or in a place where you don't know anybody. There's this thing that happens where you can suddenly hear everything and feel everything, and so this work was made sort of in the house, in and around the rooms, the living room, the bedroom, the studio. And I think it's quite different than a lot of the other works, which have some humor certainly, and but they're more rambunctious than this, I think. So this has a kind of a minimalism to it, but it also has a kind of quietness to it, which I think is unfamiliar to me. So, I'm gonna show you a couple of things from that series. And again, it is a sneak peek, so I'll have you all sign some sort of special waiver that you don't tell anyone from the Images Festival. Wait, I should ask, right? It's like if there's a police officer here. Is anyone from the Images Festival staff, or anyone from Gallery 44's board of directors? So I'm going to show you a couple of works from the new work. And then what I was hoping to do is talk a little bit with you about a couple of questions that I think I have. So, you brought up the spotlight and how the Images Festival, which is also a place I used to work. I used to work at the Images Festival. I used to work at the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center. I worked at Artside at Media City in Windsor, Film Farm. And, so it's been quite moving to be part of their 30th anniversary and to be the spotlight. But it's also, I think it's probably common to everyone. I'm sure everyone feels the same way. There's this publication, and so you start talking to curators, and you start talking to writers, and they want answers to questions that maybe you haven't even asked yourself before. And so it's been quite challenging to sort of try to summarize my practice and to try and organize my ideas, which, as you can tell, are not very formal at the best of times. So to try and organize them around, you know, what 20 or 25 years worth of art making has felt like. And, you know, I mean, the key questions keep coming up for me, and these are the ones that I think are relevant to all of us. And so, yeah, I mean, the question of how one's work is political, I think, is much more a question for me now than it ever was. And I think that there are certainly conditions that make this question much more complicated when we try to answer it. But, you know, we've been talking a little bit about like how you identify, not only as a person but as an artist, and how those might be related. You know, the question is often too, and I think you'll see it in some of the work, you know, it's like, you know, do some people feel more deeply than other people? Do some people think and feel different things than other people? Of course they do, but, you know, how does that work its way through and into your art as an artist? And I think the other thing that has become more prescient, more important for me lately, have been the questions that we have to as an artist and as an art public, I think, ask all of ourselves some of these questions, which has to do with, you know, is making things enough, right? Like if you've been making work for a long time and your work is even remotely political or has any kind of political awareness to it, I guess the question is making things enough. More of a question for me now than it ever has been, even though I've always asked it. I feel like now is a very good time to ask. And then if it is enough, then how does one, given the climate that we live in and work in, you know, how do we continue to make work without wanting to drop everything and get to Standing Rock and work across some of these more urgent issues that we face? I also think that it's key to kind of think through questions of, you know, time and as a mid-career artist, I guess, or a late mid-career. The Canada Council was, a couple of years ago, I tried to get a grant from them. I didn't get it, just so you know, and but that's okay. And but they were saying I was trying to apply as a mid-career, and they said I couldn't, and I was like, come on, just a couple more years. They were like, no, you have to be established. And I was, you know, I'm very aware of these frameworks. It's like you're an emerging artist, or you're an established artist, or you're a mid-career artist, and you know, I think that the value of a practice over time, of course, you know, you learn more, you're exposed to more conversations, you have the benefit and the privilege of talking about your work more. But I do think that there are real problematics around how we create these unofficial or inadvertent hierarchies between artists, between organizations, and between communities. So I'm going to show you a couple of the sneak peeks, and just going to make sure that the sound is running. So that's 2 minutes and 29 seconds of the hit single Baby Lint Brush that I made recently. This work is shot all in my home, so, you know, kind of working through different spaces to find, you know, environments where objects have some dominance, and to kind of like figure out what they feel like and sound like, and working across multiple channels in an installation in order to find relationships between them. But I was really noticing when I was watching this before I came here how each of these channels sort of occupies a kind of like a, I guess, a part of the biological or the function of the body, a heartbeat, you know, abdominal breathing, maybe laughter or something like that. I think of the synapses as a kind of like that's kind of like the way that we think, right? These synapses firing. So that is a good example of the new work, and I'll probably, I mean, I think a lot about how these things should be installed. So I'm probably going to do a combination of things with this, including work with an artist. His name is David Bobier. I don't know if you know him, but he's a very interesting man. He works out of London, Ontario, and he works with something called vibrofusion technology. So he and I are collaborating on presenting this so that you can hear it, as well as you'll be able to feel it through vibrations in a floor that's presented in front of it. Okay, so, yeah. Okay.
Stop. And that's good. That's a good frame right there. You ready?
Yeah, sure.
1004, 1005, just stop or no?
No.
1008, 1009, 1011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17.
So that's it for that. So it's just a couple minutes of upset, which was made at the film farm. So again, you can see how some of the site specificity comes into play. And, you know, my reliance on the everyday objects, you know, the basketball or the lint brush or the cat tree. And yeah, I guess maybe I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you.
Okay.